Thank you all for coming. And this is a really good program. Once again, you know the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution. That is synonymous with Charles Baxley. And without further ado, he's going to tell you all about how they moved the land out of Lake Marion and put it on dry land.
Well, good evening. And you know, a full house that stayed after 1.5 days and all those good meals, I feel honored. Maybe I ought to shut up and go home now and put it on the head. I have noticed most recently that people are becoming more and more independent. That means they get up and walk out in the middle if I'm not thrilling. So I don't know if I can thrill you or not, but I'm going to try. And we've had so absolutely many great presentations today. I'm overwhelmed today and yesterday about the quality of the scholarship and the enthusiasm for everyone. And this crowd is simply amazing. I have the honor tonight to talk to you about one of my most favorite battles of the American Revolution, one that has not well been studied until recently, and one which was overshadowed by Washington and Rochambeau's great victory at Yorktown, Virginia, and that is the Battle of Eutaw Springs. Eutaw Springs was the last major land battle in South Carolina. There were many other battles and skirmishes for the next year and a half, but this is where you had all the major league players of the Revolution in the South, almost without exception, fighting and achieving tactically debatable success, but absolute strategic superiority over the British. So I've been involved most recently with a number of my very dear friends in looking at 20 Revolutionary War battlefields in the Carolinas in terms of putting them on the ground where they occurred. Now, I would love to stand up here in front of you and say this is all my independent research that I've done all myself. The truth of the matter is there are many people who have contributed to the research that's ongoing, and I've given you a list of the ones who have worked on Eutaw Springs, including my friend Dick Watkins, who is here tonight, and some other folks who I suspect you know. This is a part of a project that is saving battlefields. Already, even though this report is not finished, I'll show you at the end, we are charged with drawing maps of where battlegrounds are. Property has already been purchased, money from different sources, at Eutaw Springs, at Hanging Rock, at the Battle of Waxhaws, and more property is under contract. There's property purchased in Berkeley County, 2 important tracts, and about a half a dozen others under contract. And so to me, it is absolutely essential that we get it right, because you get one chance. The window's only open for a brief time when you can get the money together to purchase these sites and save them forever. This is where the Revolutionary War, where America won her independence. All right. There you go. Battle of Eutaw Springs, I'm going to do it really fast. Major General Greene has come back to South Carolina after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He went back to Camden and did kind of a redo of the Battle of Camden, the Battle of Hobkirk Hill. He didn't hold the sand dune, which is Hobkirk Hill, but within 20 days the British knew that they could not hold the whole eastern part of South Carolina, and Lord Rawdon pulled out of Camden and went back to Charleston, thinking that he was getting ready to go back to England. They went to 96 next. They did a siege of 96, same result. The siege was not successful, and that Lord Rawdon brought fresh troops and broke the siege. But immediately they withdrew from 96 and the whole western part of South Carolina. So even though Greene lost Camden to High Creek Hill, and Greene lost 96 the battle strategically, he had just mocked the British and many of their loyalist friends out of over half of South Carolina. They met in Orangeburg. Orangeburg was a fortified village, a fortified town. Lord Rawdon was there. John Harris Kruger, the commander of 96, was there. Alexander Stewart came up from Charleston with reinforcements. Greene moved to Turkey Hill, 4 miles north of Orangeburg, said, y'all come on out and fight. And the British said, no, I think we've had enough for right now. Greene then goes back to the high hills of the Santee. And if you think around this area of South Carolina, it's a pretty good sized area to the west and to the south of Sumter, that's the so-called high hills of the Santee. He's resting and regrouping and getting his army ready to go on campaign. Lord Rawdon, I think Karen or someone said it earlier, got sick, decided he needed to go back to England. So he does withdraw from the army at Orangeburg. He leaves Alexander Stewart in command. John Harris Kruger is a loyalist officer. And I do get a little irreverent. I hope y'all will forgive me talking about Yankees a little bit here today. He's a Yankee from New York who is down here helping out the king suppress us bad rebels down here in South Carolina. So there was a warm-up. It was a civil war. It was a warm-up. But so John Harris Kruger and Stewart moved their army to Fort Mott. And so they come out of Orangeburg and move their army up to Fort Mott on the, right here on the Congaree River. Greene decides that he wants to attack the British in late August, early September 1781. So he moves north out of Stateburg area to Camden. And the reason he does that is because the Wateree River is running parallel to this route of march. It's a swamp 3 miles wide, and if the water's low, you can maybe get across it at places where there are boats, but there was no boats, and so he had to go to Camden where he could get across the river. He also has the problem that everybody in South Carolina has in the fall. The mosquitoes bite you in the summer. It takes a while for the malaria plasmosis to get going, about 6 weeks to incubate. Then you start in the fall is the sickly season, not the summer. And so he's got a number of people that he needs to leave in Camden in the hospital, suffering from all kinds of stuff, but malaria would be the number one thing. So Greene puts his army in motion, crosses the Wateree River at Camden, goes down to close to McIntyre Air Guard Base, goes south to Howell's Ferry. Howell's Ferry is about the north end of the Congaree National Park, crosses the Congaree on a ferry there, goes down the river road to Fort Mott, where he thought he was going to find Alexander Stewart and the British Field Army in South Carolina. However, one of the big strategic errors that the British make in fighting the Revolutionary War, especially in the South, is they believe that they could come with a bag full of gold and buy enough food to subsist 2,000 to 8,000 people in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. Well, there's just there is not that kind of infrastructure in place. And even if he had come in peacetime, the infrastructure was not in place to feed that many people over a day or two in any one place, anywhere in the South. It just wasn't there. They just misestimated that. Meaning that they had to have a logistical train all the way from England to put food in barrels, put them on ships, put the ships in convoy, detail Royal Navy ships to escort them across the Atlantic, fending off Spanish and French ships, American privateers, unloaded in Charleston, get across the bar in Charleston. That's no minor task in a sailboat. Unload them in Charleston, put them on a small boat, go up the Cupper River to Monk's Corner, take the stuff off a boat there, put it on a wagon, go to Nelson's Ferry, ferry it across the Santee River to Nelson's Ferry, then across 3 miles worth of swamp, and then get on the road just to get a barrel of flour to Camden. Now, there is a lot of opportunities in 1781 for that wheel to run off the track. Number one is that in all of this area of South Carolina, all over here, Francis Marion is a specialist in interdicting these supplies and interdicting the British communications, which means that not only do you have to have the manpower, wagons, and animals to move all that stuff, now you've got to detail your troops, which you really don't have that many of, to guard in force every wagon train that goes inland from Charleston. Stuart's army is hungry. There's been armies for years in the Fort Mott, McCord's Ferry area of South Carolina, and they've stripped it. I mean, all the horses, all the livestock they have on the hoof going with them, there's just not enough feed there. So Stuart moves his army by the river road and goes down to Eutaw Springs. And Eutaw Springs is about halfway from Fort Mott to the next place where there's a big British supply base, Fairlawn Barony, which is in Monk's Corner, South Carolina. So he's moving closer to his supplies. Greene, in slow, easy marching, being very careful not to let any country people know where he is, simply marches down the same road. Now, Stuart is a professional military officer of the British school, a very careful man, and he's hired at least, that we know of, 8 spies and paid them good gold to tell him when Greene's army moves. But for whatever reason, and I can't tell you what that reason is, Greene is able to move his army to John Burdell's plantation at Vance, South Carolina. Of course, Vance wasn't here at the time, but that's where it's located. That's 7 miles from the British camp, and the British commander does not know the whole American Southern Army is there, supplemented by Francis Marion's brigade, supplemented by Andrew Pickens' brigade, and supplemented by Thomas Sumter's brigade, have all moved within 7 miles and are spending the night. So early the next morning, this is September the 8th of 1781, Greene's troops start to move out, moving toward the British camp at Eutaw Springs. In 2 hours, they make it to Williams Branch, which is right here. Williams Branch is roughly where modern old South Carolina Highway 6 divides, and a dirt road goes to the north and splits off. And this is the run of the modern paved road through Eutawville to Eutaw Springs. This is the old road, which is now cleverly named Monk's Corner Road. It is a stunningly beautiful 1-lane oak canopy, no power line dirt road that is the same identical road that Greene moved his army. Now they needed to stop right here. They needed to stop right there because they hadn't had any breakfast. And so Greene, being a great military commander, decides that they need to have not 1, but 2 gills of rum for breakfast. Because he knows that they're heading into a fierce battle. They're heading into a hornet's nest. And if you're getting ready to go stick your hand in a hornet's nest, a little bit of rum would go a long way to help you make that decision. That's a good idea. Now Lee writes 30 years after, unless his light horse Harry Lee, Robert E. Lee's father, is there, and he is leading what we call the van, the elements out front. And Lee calls this in his book a trap. And the trap is right here. The trap is the infantry is walking down this road that is about the width of one of our dinner tables. And out on each side, a couple hundred yards, are a couple hundred cavalrymen. So that if you ride down the road and bump into these guys, you say, well, this is just a little bit of infantry. You know, I can take these on. But you don't see these two flankers, very skillful, heavily armed guys on big horses with long, curved cavalry sabers getting ready to come and whack at you. And I can tell you, I do know why they're curved. The Karen didn't tell you this, but the cavalry guy did. But if you're riding along and you stick that sword into someone, you keep moving, and you can't hardly get it out if it's straight. It needs to be curved so you can get it out. So experience taught them to put a little curve on that thing. It makes it stronger too. So about 6 a.m., they get over having their little cocktail party in the morning, and about that time, a group of soldiers comes out of Stewart's camp, here at Eutaw Springs. And we're about out here at the 3-mile mark. So Greene has moved his army within 3 to 3.5 miles of the British camp, about the British knowing. Now, unbeknownst to Greene, 2 of his soldiers, who were probably South Carolina loyalists, who were recruited to be in Pickens' brigade, defected to the British. At about the same time, they go hoofing it into Stewart's camp and saying, ooh, guess what? Nathaniel Greene and the whole Southern Continental Army is just right down the road. Well, Stewart really doesn't believe these guys. Number one, they're yahoos, and we know that they're deserters. So, I mean, you know, you consider these 2 hardened criminals that have come to tell you something, you don't believe them. But he does get John Coffin, who has about 45 cavalrymen, his only cavalryman he has, because he's been beat up 8 days before at Parker's Ferry by none other than Francis Marion, who whacked off a bunch of his cavalry, and sends them out with 140 crackerjack light infantrymen of the Provincial Light Infantry. And so that's who's out. They're riding to the west on this road and bump into Light Horse Harry Lee. Well, Harry Lee's infantry and Coffin's cavalry mix it up, but immediately Lee's flankers come in. William Henderson is commanding Sumter's troops. His mounted elements come in. So there's about 150 of Lee's Legion cavalry there in the road, infantry in the road. There's about 200 of Lee's Legion cavalry coming in, and there's about 200 cavalrymen under William Henderson coming in. And needless to say, the British are surprised, and the British are chopped up. Coffin's cavalry immediately disengages, because they weren't really out there to beat Greene's army. They were just out there to see if anybody was really there. And they found out there was somebody really there. But what happened is they lost about 6 people killed and wounded on the ground. But the Americans were able to capture 40 of the Provincial Light Infantry. So now Greene, really without even meaning to get into the battle yet, has already gotten about 50 of the men that the British have at Eutaw Springs. And this is before the battle gets going. Now on this map, you can see right there in the road is a curve. That curve is still there. What that means is that if you're coming from west to east this way, and if you're coming from east to west that way, it's not a steep curve, it's just enough curve where you can't see anybody coming around the curve. So if you're standing on either side, you know, a car can come and you might hear it coming, but you're not going to see it coming. So the skirmish just happened to occur at that curve, and nobody much had a chance to get ready for it, but the British really lost. Now, I told you earlier that the British had underestimated, if that's the right way to say it, the supply ability of the American countryside after 6 years of war to support the British field army. At this point, South Carolina could barely feed itself, much less several thousand visitors from other places. So every morning, while Stuart is there at Eutaw, he had detailed about 20% of his soldiers to get up before daylight and take 4 cartridge of ammunition, their musket and their bayonet, and go to the plantations on the Santee River in this area. That's why it's kind of hashed in there, to dig sweet potatoes. And when I first got interested in this, I figured that they were digging them out of people's sweet potato cellars. That's what I figured. But thankfully, my friend Keith Gordine knows something about sweet potatoes, and he straightened me out because he said the first week of September, all of last year's sweet potatoes have already been eaten, especially since armies for years have been going up and down this road, and that the only sweet potatoes are the ones you're going to dig out of the ground would be ready and edible. So they were actually out there getting today and tomorrow's meals. Now that's 20% of the British Army out there in the field. Now these people, the ones especially who are out this far, are some of Britain's crackerjack soldiers called the 3rd Brigade of House Guards. These are the crackerjack best soldiers in the whole British Army, and 20% of them are out there digging. So when they hear the fighting, they don't run away, they run to the fight. Okay? They're like good Scots-Irish people from where I'm from. If there's a fight, they don't run away. They say, let me in, you know? I want to get in on this. So, what happens is the British diggers come in, about 210 of them don't know that they're running to the whole Southern Continental Army. And they are surrounded and overwhelmed. There's hardly any fight. But 210 plus the other 50, that's 260 people Greene has captured of Stuart's army before the battle really starts. And these are irreplaceable soldiers because Britain can't recruit hardly anybody else, and they can't afford to put any more people on the battlefield in North America because they're busy protecting their other interests, meaning the Caribbean, Gibraltar, India, and the homelands for that matter. So if Greene had stopped right there, turned around and gone back to the high hills of Santee, he's lost 1 or 2 people at this point and caught, almost 300. So it's a pretty good victory at that point. So the cavalry has run back here to Stuart and said, "You're not going to believe what we just saw." And Stuart, then gets his drummers to beat General Porter's or to arms or whatever it is they were beating with those drums. And he was getting ready because he knew that Greene was coming after him. The 100 or so light infantrymen are trained in many arts. The light infantrymen, to use a football example, are your ends, or your running backs, or your full backs, or your best athletes. These are the guys who can put on a sack, take a heavy musket, wear a wool coat in September in South Carolina and run 20 miles and not mind doing it. Now that's not your typical British soldier, but that's who is the light infantry. And these guys are battle-hardened. They've been battling Francis Marion, and they've been, most of these guys have been fighting the whole Revolutionary War. So these are the survivors, these aren't the slackers. So they do, in my opinion, a fighting withdrawal, which means they take off down the road, they find a place where they gives them a little concealment and cover. They stop, they hide, they wait on the American advanced elements, they fire a shot, and they take off and do it again. And so some of the pensioners remember that there was skirmishing, if you will, pushing the British back from this point all the way to they meet the main British battle lines. Now, in doing this mapping project, I had a couple people ask me, well, how do you know how to do this? Well, we're looking at all the primary sources that we can find. We're looking at all the people who've interpreted the battlefield before the mapping. We are reading all the pension statements of anybody we can find who fought there, which we consider to be a primary source. And we are looking at the archaeology that has been done. There are 2 formal archaeology projects. And we're looking at aerial LiDAR. And aerial LiDAR was not at all designed for archaeologists, I can promise you. But it is a wonderful and powerful archaeological tool. And this is the LiDAR of the Eutaw Springs area. The LiDAR is kind of like radar, except that instead of using radio waves to bounce it off of things, to see how fast you're going or to see where the airplanes are, it's using light beam, it's using laser. And the airplane flies over the area you're mapping, it shoots many, many pulses of light, it measures precisely the time for the bounce of those light beams. That determines the elevation of whatever the light beam bounced off of. Then some extremely clever computer programmers have figured out how to filter out the bounces that come off of trees and tree limbs and stuff like that, so that you can, in essence, spray Agent Orange on the whole area, defoliate it, and just get the ground. So this is a LiDAR map of the area of Eutaw Springs with all the foliation going off the trees. Pretty good magic. This feature right here is the trace of the railroad bed that went to the sawmill town of Ferguson, South Carolina. That's the sawmill that's gone and mostly under Lake Marion now. The tracks aren't there, but it left quite an impression on the ground. This is the Monk's Corner Road coming in from the west. Eutaw Springs is in this neck of the woods here, and in this neck of the woods here. This is where the brick house was, and the open area, about 8-acre open area where the British were camped. And the Americans are coming from this way. And what we were doing is looking for the road to Roaches. Well, what difference does that make? And what is Roaches? What does that mean? Alexander Stewart, the British commander, wrote 3 letters to his boss, Lord Cornwallis. And he is very interested in getting his own spin put on things, because he lost a pile of men here, and he let the Americans sneak within 3.5 miles of his camp without knowing about it. And so he wrote letters for public consumption, and he wrote letters for private consumption. But one of the things we want to do is figure out where the fighting was on the ground. And you can do that by old maps, you can do that by archaeology, because lead balls don't move around much, and you can tell whether they were fired or when they were dropped or what caliber they were, and deduce what gun they may have come out of. But Stewart said, I deployed the south flank or the left flank of my army across the road to Roaches. Okay, so we go out there, is there a road to Roaches anywhere? No, there's not. Supreme Court Justice William Johnson wrote an amazing book in the early 1800s, which was a study of the life of Nathaniel Greene. He was the Chief Justice from Charleston. He's a lawyer by training, and I don't know who that... Karen, you said bad things about lawyers. I don't know about you. You are one, and I'm not sure. My mother used to say that it's a poor bird who didn't praise his own nest, or something like that. Anyway, we wanted to find out where the road to Roaches was. William Johnson, on his map, labeled this Old River Road. That goes to Pond Bluff Plantation, and it originally went down to Keith Gordine's house at St. Stephen's and Pineville, and he labeled that as the road to Roaches. Well, 2 problems with that. Number one, if the Americans are coming from this way, and you know it, and this is your camp you're trying to protect, why would you put a wing of your army out here behind you? It doesn't make any sense. And number 2, Dick, I asked Dick a very simple question, which took him only 6 months to answer, of work. Now, I'm not talking about his good and all. But he looked all this down this road to see if any Roaches owned any land, and they didn't. Now, the Roach family owned land grants all over the place. And so if we could find a land grant somewhere in this area, we might have an idea of where the road to Roaches was. So Dick and Steve Katzenberg from Orangeburg did a lot of work, and they found that Francis Roach owned something called Wampee Plantation. If you go down this road right here, about 2.5 miles, you come to what is even labeled today on the Orangeburg County GIS as Wampee 1 and Wampee 2. Now I know what Wampee means. Y'all didn't know I spoke Indian, but I do. Wampee means swamp that stupid Englishman will pay you beads for. That's what it means. And if you go all over South Carolina, there's a bunch of Wampees. So it's not, this is the only one. So we wanted to know where the roaches were. So we know that if you go from Eutaw Springs, about 2.5 miles due south, you get to Francis Roaches, not Patrick's. Is that right? So we looked on the map, and you can see a pretty good trace right there. And if you follow that out, there's not a modern road there. It's all grown up and grown over. You might could walk down it and follow it, but it's a very definite trace, and it goes almost, not quite in a straight line, but almost in a straight line to Patrick Roaches. And guess what? If you want to know where the south flank of Stuart's army is, and you use that as a reference, you're dead on where it ought to be. Now, there's not been a huge amount of archaeology in this area yet, but we know that there is stuff that is found in this area here. Now, we all know that South Carolina, the coastal plain, is flat as a pancake, right? Except for those pesky Carolina bays, those percoastals. But if you look at this map, you will see all kinds of features. See all these things? And here's one that's got water in it. And here's one, and of course this is the lake. There's a hole there, hole there, hole there, hole there. Those are all products of the underlying limestone. There are areas in South Carolina that look just like here, but if you drill down just a little bit, there's a layer of limestone. And Eutaw Springs happens to have that. So does Santee State Park. And my son-in-law has a farm up here on Tall Call Creek on this side of the lake. It's got a limestone sinkhole. Well, that gives you sinkholes, it gives you limestone springs, and all the features that are associated with this, what we call karst topography. And so the topography here and the underlying limestone matters for this reason. Well, there's the road to Roaches. I'll come back to karst. William Johnson's map is what I call a stylized map, because he didn't start with surveying the actual geography. He just kind of drew things in. And this was the map that if you go to West Point today and take military history, your instructor is going to flash up on the screen something that looks like this, because battle mapping with any accuracy has never been done at Eutaw Springs. Now, interestingly enough, at most major Revolutionary War battles, we have a period map. You know, an engineer or somebody good at cartography on one side or the other took the trouble of drawing a pretty good map. The Siege of Charleston, there's a half a dozen of them or more. The Battle of Camden, there's 4 or 5 pretty good maps. I mean, sometimes they're not perfect, but they're pretty good maps. But at Eutaw Springs, there is no such thing, and this is the best we could do. Now, let's say that you're a member, you're Richard Wynn, and you're out in Eutaw Springs, and you're a member of Congress, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court invites you over for some Madeira to talk about your role in the Revolutionary War. Well, anybody who was up there or in Charleston when he was doing his research, after about 3 or 4 glasses of Madeira's roll gets bigger and bigger. And their memory, doing this 25 years or so later, can often be a little bit skewed. But it's just better than nothing, because at least Justice Johnson is actually talking to people who were actually there, and they weren't seeing the overview of fighting, but they were certainly seeing what was in front of them and who was shooting at them. All right. Okay. So what's the point? The point is to take a modern topographic map and put who was where on the map. And then we're going to show how they mixed it up. Here is the proverbial road to Roaches. And here are the British troops lined up around the road to Roaches. Here is the brick house and the barn. Here's the palisaded garden. The springs are here and here, the big blue dots. And we know where they were because my friend Drew Ruddy is a professional diver. He said, I'll go down there and find those spring heads for you. And he did. And here are the 3 units in reserve. And here is Stuart's deployment, like this. And here is General Green's deployment. Now, General Green had an opportunity to debrief Daniel Morgan for what alignment he used for his troops at Cowpens. And General Green had in his army a good many Maryland and Delaware soldiers that survived the Battle of Camden and knew what didn't work. At Camden, Gates put the Virginia and North Carolina militia to guard his whole left wing. It collapsed mostly without firing a shot. Because to put militia in a line and expect them to hold up the bayonet-toting professional British soldiers coming at you is something that just ain't going to work. Well, at Cowpens, Daniel Morgan put his troops in 3 lines with the militia out front, and he told the militia, y'all ain't, they're riflemen, they're frontiersmen. They can shoot. They know how to shoot a bear or a squirrel for supper, whatever they need to kill. Maybe an Indian, never know. He put them in 3 lines, and he told the guys out front, y'all try to get off 2 shots and then run like hell. Now, militiamen know how to do that. And that didn't give the British hardly a chance to organize to charge you with cavalry or shoot at you with a cannon or to charge you with bayonets and a musket. So Green, in essence, does the same thing. Militia out front. Continental soldiers on line number 2. And line number 3 doesn't have quite enough people to make a whole full line, but he has William Washington's cavalry back there, as well as Robert Kirkwood's Delaware Continentals that by now are treated and trained and act as light troops. This is kind of his emergency reserve, if you will. Out in front, he pushes a 2 3-pound cannons and says, y'all push out as far as you can, and when you see redcoats, just start shooting, and shoot as long as you can and disrupt them as best you can, and when you can't do that anymore, pull back. That was kind of his orders. So he did. So here we are, we have the troops moving forward. This is probably 8:30 or 9 a.m. And they begin an engagement. That's Francis Marion. Francis Marion is not only commanding his brigade, but he's commanding the whole militia on the south side of the river road. So he's acting sort of as an area commander. In addition to his militia, Lee's Legion infantry, who are Continental soldiers, are there, and Samuel Hammond and probably 2 other South Carolina state troops cavalry are anchoring that right flank. The first people that we know of that really get tangled up is up here on this end. Stuart has used Eutaw Creek as his flank cover. Now let's go back to karst topography. We have photographs, we have topographic maps of Eutaw Creek before the dam, before Lake Marion. There's several springs in this area, 2 springs here. The water, this is a hole right here. If you go down in this cone-shaped hole, about 25 feet, is this beautiful bowl spring, underground stream. It runs under this peninsula of land here, which is where the park is today. It runs under it and comes back out on the west side right there. It's the same springs underground, comes out and forms the creek. The creek is down in a 25-foot deep little valley with steep sides and a flat bottom that is half as wide as this room. In this area, Greene puts a brigade of the flank battalions. And the British Army, you have a flank battalion, which if you line up in parade are the one on the far left and the far right. One of those is your light infantrymen, your best athletes, and then on the other side are your guards and your tackles. These are the biggest guys who used to be in charge of throwing grenades, which was like a lit cannonball, kind of like Roadrunner style, except they blew up so many grenadiers they quit doing that. But these are the companies of the most crackerjack units, hand-selected out of the whole regiment, and then 6 or 5 different regiments, light infantry and grenadiers banded together. We call it brigade. And so that is who is got this interstate highway undercover down in a hole from here 3/4 of a mile out all the way back to headquarters. You can see that it comes in at about a 45-degree angle. So as the British are pushed back toward their house, and as the Americans push to the east, it begins to squeeze the battle line and push these Americans here into these British. Now the British troops are not down in the hole. They're using the hole kind of like any good soldier would. They're using it to communicate back and forth, but anytime they need to move, let's say they need to go from here to here to here, they just pop in through the trees, down in the hole, move and come back up again. And Greene can't see any of this. And so there's 350 of these guys, and to add insult to injury, all along the bank of the creek is a thicket. You know, it's pretty good soil and pretty good moisture, and so you get a thicket. And sometimes it was written up as a blackjack thicket, but what difference that makes is, this is the first weekend, second week in September, the leaves are on all the trees. A man can get back into this thicket easily, but a horse cannot follow. Okay? So many of the casualties that the Americans take is on this north flank as they fight for control of this thicket. And I don't even think Greene knows that this declivity is back here with the creek in it. But that's the limestone topography giving the British a huge advantage. So the battle becomes general across the front. Cannons are brought into play. Horsemen are brought into play. It is written that Marion's men fired 17 shots. They stood in line, unlike militiamen, and fired till they ran out of ammunition, which is amazing. But they were commanded, and this is not Marion, the partisan warrior. This is Marion, the continental officer, doing a linear battle in the European style, but making his troops stand toe-to-toe with crackerjack British units. This slide shows that when Marion and the other militiamen run out of ammunition, they fall back through the American lines. They don't run off, but they fall back into reserve positions, and the Continentals come up. The next thing that happens is the British left or south flank actually comes forward a little bit. They see the Continentals there with their bayonets. They say something like, "Oh," and they take off into their camp. Now, 8 acres sounds like a lot of land if you're talking about a house and a subdivision, but it's really only 8 houses. And the British have 2,000 people camping there. They have